Before dawn on October 25, 1944, the sky above the Philippines burned with lightning that wasn't from the clouds. 6 American destroyers, thin, under-armored, and nearly out of ammunition, found themselves staring down the largest warships on Earth. Ahead of them came the thunder of Yamato and Kongō, Japan's floating fortresses, each capable of leveling a city with a single broadside. Behind them, nothing but unarmed escort carriers and the wounded of yesterday's battle. The order from Admiral Clifton Sprague crackled through the radio. "Turn toward the enemy." In that instant, every law of naval warfare was broken. Destroyers built to protect carriers now charged at an enemy 10 times their size, laying smoke, launching torpedoes, and vanishing into sheets of fire. The sea erupted into chaos, metal against metal, courage against destiny. It would be remembered as the battle off Samar, the moment when ordinary sailors became legends, and 6 tin cans stood against the storm. If you were on one of those destroyers, would you have turned toward the enemy too? Dawn crept over the Philippine Sea like a secret the sky was trying to keep. The waves rolled quietly under a pale orange haze, and to the men of Taffy 3, a small task unit of escort carriers and destroyers, it felt like just another morning patrol. They brewed coffee, checked torpedo tubes, joked about heading home once Leyte was secure. None of them knew that a Japanese surface fleet, the largest concentration of battleships still afloat, was already racing toward them from the north. At 06:45, radar screens began to flicker. A young operator aboard the USS Heermann rubbed his eyes, thinking it was interference. Then the blips multiplied. Dozens of returns, closing fast, too large to be aircraft. Moments later, the horizon turned black with the outlines of Yamato, Kongō, Nagato, and their escorts, armor-plated giants with guns big enough to crush cities. When Commander Ernest Evans ordered flank speed, full ahead, the destroyer USS Johnston leapt forward like a creature defying death itself. Her engines howled, her bow sliced through walls of spray, and her crew gripped their stations in silence. No one needed to ask why. Evans had already told them on his first day in command, "This is a fighting ship. I intend to go in harm's way." Now those words weren't just a motto, they were prophecy. The Japanese formation loomed ahead like a moving mountain range. Yamato, the largest warship ever built, trained her 18-inch guns toward the charging American destroyer. Each turret weighed more than the Johnston itself. The sea around her glowed white as the first salvos screamed overhead, landing so close that columns of boiling water towered over the bridge. But Evans didn't flinch. He barked over the radio, "Commence firing!" The Johnston's 5-inch guns roared, rapid, defiant, hopelessly small against the enemy. But every round counted. Gunners tracked a Japanese cruiser at 9,000 yards and scored direct hits that set its deck ablaze. Then Evans gave the most suicidal order of all. "Prepare torpedoes!" The destroyer swerved hard to port, charging straight through her own smoke screen, heading right into the center of the enemy line. Her crew could now see the rising suns painted on enemy hulls, the flash of gunfire, the spray of shrapnel against the sea. Aboard the bridge, Evans's shirt was torn by flying glass, blood streaming down his face, but his voice stayed calm. The torpedo officer waited until the range dropped below 10,000 yards. "Fire 1! Fire 2!" 6 white trails darted across the ocean. Seconds later, an explosion ripped through the Japanese cruiser Kumano, tearing its bow apart. Shockwaves rolled through the formation. The world's most powerful navy had just been wounded by a single tin can. As the Johnston veered away under a rain of steel, the radio crackled with disbelief from nearby ships. "Who's attacking? Who's out front?" A voice answered through static, half laughter, half fury. "That's Johnston. She's making her run." The sea had turned into fire, and Evans was steering straight through it. As Johnston disappeared into a wall of smoke, the rest of Taffy 3 could only watch in stunned silence. To the north, the destroyers USS Hoel and USS Heermann turned hard into the wind, throttles wide open. They were outgunned, outnumbered, and out of options, but not out of courage. The air crackled with radio chatter. Taffy 3 to all ships. Commence torpedo attacks. Give those carriers a chance. Each destroyer understood what that meant. Buy time with their lives. From above, a squadron of FM-2 Wildcats and Avenger torpedo bombers dived from the clouds, their engines wailing. They weren't equipped with armor-piercing bombs. Some had nothing more than depth charges or machine guns. But they attacked anyway. Pilots flew so low that seawater sprayed their canopies. One gunner shouted over the intercom, "If we don't stop them now, there won't be a later." Down below, the destroyer Hoel fired her torpedoes at a Japanese cruiser closing in on the escort carriers. Seconds later, fire blossomed across the horizon. A hit. The enemy broke formation, momentarily confused. That single moment would change everything. The escort carriers, Fanshawe Bay, White Plains, Kalinin Bay, Kitkun Bay, St. Lo, Gambier Bay, began turning east at full speed, launching every aircraft they could. Pilots took off without proper armament, some without fuel to return. The sky filled with smoke, tracers, and chaos. Meanwhile, USS Heermann, the last destroyer still fully operational, charged directly at Yamato herself. The Japanese giant unleashed a broadside so massive that it lifted the sea. But somehow, every shell missed. Heermann's torpedoes streaked forward, forcing Yamato to turn away. The world's most powerful battleship had just retreated, from a destroyer 1/20th her size. For the first time, the Japanese Admiral Kurita hesitated. His fleet was under aerial attack, destroyers were slashing through his lines, and the sea was littered with burning wrecks. In his war diary, he later wrote, "The enemy was not retreating. They were attacking." That confusion bought the Americans precious minutes, enough for the escort carriers to escape east. But back near the smoke, Johnston was still fighting alone, bleeding from every wound. Commander Evans's voice came faintly over the radio. "Keep the bastards busy." Johnston still in the fight. The tide was beginning to turn, bought with steel, fire, and the hearts of ordinary men. Commander Ernest Evans of the destroyer USS Johnston didn't wait for orders. He slammed his hand on the intercom. "All hands to battle stations. We're going in." Below decks, engineers scrambled through narrow corridors as the ship's sirens wailed. Gunners swung their turrets toward an enemy so massive it filled the sea itself. They were outgunned, outarmored, and outnumbered nearly 10-1. But in that moment, hesitation wasn't an option. Admiral Clifton Sprague aboard USS Fanshawe Bay gave the only command that made sense when escape was impossible. "Launch every plane. Lay smoke. Turn toward the enemy." The phrase rippled across the task group like a prayer and a death sentence combined. Destroyers peeled from formation, carving white arcs into the sea, their wakes foaming with fury. As the first salvos roared across the water, the morning sky shattered into thunder. Columns of spray erupted around the carriers as 18-inch shells slammed into the sea. Yet those tiny destroyers, the tin cans, charged ahead, their decks trembling under full power. They weren't supposed to fight a battle like this. But history doesn't wait for those who are ready, only for those who refuse to run. What would you have done if you were there that day? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I want to see how you'd react in that moment. By the spring of 1943, the rusted graveyard at Pearl Harbor was slowly coming alive. Beneath the tropical stillness, the harbor floor pulsed with new rhythm. Air compressors rumbling, pumps thudding, and men shouting through steel helmets. Every dive now carried purpose. Every sound meant life being forced back into dead machines. On the USS Nevada, engineers finally achieved what many had called impossible. For months, she had sat half-sunk and stubborn, her hull buried deep in silt, a silent monument to the first wave of Japanese bombs. But on a morning heavy with mist, the pumps roared louder than ever. Mud boiled up through the water as the battleship slowly lifted, like something alive dragging itself out of a grave. Crowds gathered along the docks, sailors, widows, children of men who'd died aboard. No one spoke. They just watched as the gray giant broke the surface again. Its decks were mangled, its turrets bent, its scars visible from shore. Yet somehow, seeing it rise felt like the island itself had taken its first breath in 2 years. Across the yard, divers were still working inside West Virginia, inch by inch, through twisted corridors that had once been living quarters. The stench of fuel oil and death lingered. Each time they found a name carved into a wall or a dented helmet wedged under debris, they stopped, saluted, then kept going. Because stopping meant letting history sink again. Commander Homer Wallen, the man who'd refused to abandon the wrecks, stood on the pier that day and didn't smile. He just nodded once quietly to his men. Later, in his diary, he wrote, "The ships are more than steel. They are the measure of our will." And in that moment, Pearl Harbor wasn't a place of defeat anymore. It had become a workshop of resurrection, proof that even from the ocean's silence, something powerful could return to life. The horizon was nothing but thunder. At 0700 hours, the sea east of Samar exploded into a sheet of orange flame. Shells the size of cars screamed through the air, slicing into the ocean with detonations that lifted entire walls of water. The American destroyers, Hoel, Johnston, and Heermann, were no longer fighting a battle. They were surviving 1 second at a time. Lieutenant Commander Ernest Evans of the Johnston had already taken his ship into a suicidal charge 15 minutes earlier. His last known transmission still echoed through the fleet's radios. "Commence attack! I'm going in." Every sailor who heard it knew what it meant. Evans was throwing his 2,000-ton destroyer against a 70,000-ton monster, the Yamato. The Johnston's forward gun spat flame at nearly point-blank range. Her torpedoes streaked out across the waves, thin white scars in the sea. When one of them struck the heavy cruiser Kumano, the blast ripped through her bow, a miracle hit that forced the Japanese line to stagger. For a few seconds, the impossible happened. Chaos found the enemy. Above, dive bombers from the escort carriers screamed down through flak clouds, dropping whatever bombs they had left. Depth charges, even machine gun ammo. It didn't matter. The sky was burning, and so was the sea. The Hoel followed in next, her decks torn open by direct hits. One shell obliterated her bridge. Another ripped through her engine room. But her gunners stayed. They loaded by hand, covered in steam and blood, until the barrels glowed red. They weren't just firing. They were holding the line for the men behind them. By now, the Japanese admirals were convinced they'd been ambushed by a major fleet. It made no sense. Who would charge battleships with destroyers? They turned their binoculars toward the horizon and saw nothing but fire and smoke. Confusion spread through the enemy formation like a storm through glass. Orders tangled. The mighty Yamato herself hesitated, her bridge echoing with frantic commands. For the Americans, hesitation was salvation. Every minute the enemy slowed, another carrier escaped south. Another group of pilots refueled. Another sailor lived. At 0900, Johnston was dead in the water. Evans stood on the stern, half his uniform burned away, giving orders through a megaphone because his radios were gone. He refused to abandon ship until he was sure his crew had jumped. When the last lifeboat drifted free, he saluted the flag still fluttering above the mast. Torn, blackened, but unbroken. Then Johnston slid beneath the waves. Witnesses said the water around her boiled red as her boilers burst. The ocean roared, but not in victory. When the guns finally stopped, the silence felt unnatural. Smoke drifted across the Pacific like torn flags. The horizon was littered with oil fires, black plumes twisting into the clouds where the destroyers had once stood. The sea that had been boiling with explosions now only whispered, carrying the smell of cordite and steel. There were bodies in the water, life jackets bobbing among the wreckage, and the faint, broken voices of men calling for rescue. For hours, small boats moved through the debris, searching. Sailors pulled others aboard with trembling hands, many too burned to speak. They said the water was warm, not from the sun, but from the burning fuel that still floated on its surface. And somewhere beyond the smoke, the great ships of Japan, Yamato, Kongō, Chikuma, Suzuya, turned north again, limping home in disbelief. The Americans they had expected to annihilate were gone, but so were their own illusions of invincibility. In the surviving U.S. fleet, a strange stillness settled. Messages began to circulate. Johnston lost. Hoel gone. Gambier Bay sank. Yet the tone of those reports was not defeated. Every transmission carried a quiet pride, a belief that something unbreakable had been proven that morning. The enemy had seen courage it couldn't measure. They had watched men fight until their guns melted. Destroyers charged battleships with nothing but smoke and willpower. And in that madness, the U.S. Navy's tin can sailors wrote their names into eternity. Days later, survivors were pulled from the open sea, sunburned, dehydrated, eyes hollow but still alert. One was asked what kept him alive out there, drifting between wreckage and sharks. He said quietly, "We couldn't let them think we'd given up, not after what the others did." News of the battle reached Washington, then the world. Newspapers called it the Battle off Samar, but the sailors who lived through it just called it the day we turned back giants. Because that morning, history itself tilted. Japan's surface fleet, the pride of its empire, never again fought a major naval battle. The destroyers that should have died bought time, bought safety, and bought the rest of the war. In 1958, survivors of the Johnston gathered in a reunion. They raised a glass to their captain, Ernest Evans, posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor, and to every man who had gone down with him. One sailor said, "We never had the biggest ships. We just had the biggest hearts." The room fell quiet after that, the kind of silence that feels holy. And out in the Pacific, the wrecks still rest under 3 miles of water, silent, rusting, sleeping beneath the blue. But each year, when Navy ships cross that same stretch of sea, they slow their engines. They look to the horizon where smoke once hung, and remember the day destroyers charged the impossible, and live to tell it. If you were on one of those destroyers that morning, knowing you were outnumbered, outgunned, and probably doomed, would you have turned toward the enemy like they did? Let me know your answer in the comments. I read every single one.